Jacques Peretti is an investigative journalist and broadcaster whose award-winning television series include The Men Who Made Us Spend, The Super Rich and Us, and £1 Trillion Island. He's written articles for The Guardian, Wired, and The Huffington Post, and his book, Done, The Secret Deals That Are Changing Our World, tells the story of the billion-dollar handshakes that never make the news, but are revolutionising everything we do. Jacques, welcome to our show.
Thank you. Bless you for inviting me.
We're really thrilled that you're here. Just to give you a quick understanding of like what my motivation is I'm at university doing a course, Religion in Global Politics, so as universities. I'm really enjoying it, getting an academic understanding of things that I've intuitively understood for a little while. Now, like your field of expertise is the often submerged financial narrative that's actually governing and dominating our world from an ecological perspective, media. Can you?
No, follow the money. That's all that you need to do. That old cliche, but it happens to be a cliche for a reason, which is if you follow the money and you understand where the money's coming from, who's making the money, what the economics underlying everything we do, from the coffee we buy to the job we go to why we decide to buy that phone over another phone. All of these things have economics at their heart. And so if you don't understand economics, you don't understand how the world works.
What then should we understand about the world as we're experiencing it now? Who are the dominant economic players that are determining what happens in the lives of we ordinary people?
Well, I think we are. I mean, Trump has thrown a kind of spanner in the works, and he's kind of, I suppose what that represents, as we know, is it represents a kind of dislocation of the old status quo. But that was because that wasn't working. And essentially what we've had over the last 40 years, and he's a kind of, I suppose, a symptom or a public creation, is what we call corporate capture, which is, I suppose, the creeping end of government, elected government, and the rise of global corporations. And we kind of know about that. But I think what's really interesting about that, for me, is that corporations haven't done this out of some kind of evil Machiavellian plot. It's just been a kind of failure of government to be able to run the countries that they supposedly run. You have a world that I see as kind of that operates on two different levels. You have horizontally corporations who operate across the globe, so they don't have any need to worry about territorial boundaries. Governments operate vertically; they operate within the narrow constraints of the geographical state of which they operate. The two just don't meet, and I think as the world's become increasingly globalized, corporations have just got the whip hand, and essentially government has become a kind of a civil service for corporations.
So the nation state, which is a relatively modern idea, has already been made in power terms redundant because of the global power of transnational corporations and the sort of resurgence of an identity politics is a sort of a response to that. So who are the corporations?
Yeah, and I think that's not. I think that's what's interesting about that is that. That's just the kind of logic of the way economics has gone. I mean, if you look at Putin, he's not really the leader of Russia. Well, he's the CEO of Russia PLC. Trump is the CEO of a ailing corporation called the United States. And so I think it's interesting that we have business people and autocrats who are increasingly coming to prominence because there's a kind of almost implicit realization that that's the way the state has to be run. So it's not a sort of left-right kind of thing. It's just that that's the nature of the way the world is going.
The state has to mimic corporate models because the corporate model is now the dominant model. The state idea is sort of redundant, doesn't make sense now, and we know that, but we can't admit that because otherwise democracy becomes explicitly a farce.
Absolutely, and you had that under Cameron and under Blair. You had the first sort of intimations of this, where they started talking about the John Lewis model, or they'd start to say, "Oh, what if Britain was run like John Lewis?" And then that sort of got
at least the adverts would be good.
Exactly. And now it's become the Google model. So it's like, how can and I went to this conference which was basically run by, it was organised by some big corporations, and they asked me to go and speak to them. And I said, well, have you not seen my documentaries? Why are you asking me to come and talk? Well, we were interested in what you had to say. And the way they were talking about corporate tax, specifically about corporation tax and the avoidance, which is an issue in the air, remains an issue in the air. They were sort of saying, tax is such a redundant idea. It's such an inefficient way of collecting money from us. We don't want to pay it. Governments don't know how to collect it. Why don't we run the NHS? Why don't we just do it directly? And the sort of what was staggering was the kind of the breadth of their ambition. They didn't see any limits on what they should be doing. Yeah.
Well, we had Professor David Harvey, Marxist professor, in here, and he says, sort of stitched into the ideology of capitalism, which obviously I don't need to tell you, but to reiterate for our listeners, is the idea of infinite, limitless growth. So, and that Marx's theory at origin points out the flaw that we've got limited resources, so inevitably capitalism will have to mask itself. We're going to need a critical theory that continually exposes the fallacy of a model that has infinite growth built into it.
What you had was an amazing moment. I mean, when you look at disposable consumerism, and if you look at the way that the planet is going in terms of limited resources and what's ultimately going to happen.
Disposable consumerism, do you just mean?
So, things that we throw away. So stuff that we buy, things that we buy cheaply. So the rise of the whole rise of high street rise of Primark, TK Maxx, Lidl, all these brands that basically produce goods that we could buy cheaply. When you look at that moment, 2000, around about 2000, the key moment, that's the very moment where global economies are beginning to stagnate. Wages are beginning to freeze. What we'd had was 40 years of quote unquote growth where prices rose, but so did wages in tandem with it. At that moment, suddenly, what happens? Wages freeze. People's living standards can no longer increase. So what do? We make products that cost next to nothing. So people have the appearance of improving living standards, but products just getting cheaper and cheaper. And of course, the price is paid by the planet. And so this is these are the kind of the economics underlying consumerism, underlying where we are right now.
Who are the most powerful global corporations?
Well,
when we talk about this,
it used to be the oil companies and the mining companies and the retail and the food. Unilever, so Unilever, Monsanto, Nestle, Coca-Cola. Those companies run food.
Really, those were the big ones.
Yeah,
so and sugar and fat and food.
What's extraordinary? Oxfam did an amazing graphic where basically what they've done is taken the 600 or so biggest companies on the planet, and then they've drawn their connections to the bigger company that owns them, right? So it's like this extraordinary family tree, which ends up with literally 5 companies running everything. And you think, that's extraordinary. That's like, if you wanted to believe in conspiracy theories, well, just look at the graphics. So, you don't have to believe in conspiracy theories to understand that very few companies are in charge of everything. But now, in the last 15 years, what we've seen is the rise of the tech companies, obviously, Google, Apple, Microsoft, Amazon. These are the companies that now people consider to be the most powerful companies on the
And are they the most powerful?
Because of what they own for the future. They'll own data. They own data. They own everything there is to know about all of us.
So they're prospectively the most powerful. Are you saying that the way that we evaluate power is changing? It's not necessarily now about capital. It's about potential power because of data. Yeah. Data is the new capital.
Data is the new oil. Data is the new oil.
Because why?
Well, because it's the most precious commodity on the planet.
Because if you own data, that means you can market specifically to people, you can control them, and you control their consuming.
Once you've got Russell Brand's house, and Russell Brand's house's heating is controlled by a phone, which collects all the data and then collects all the data on what you buy, collects all the data on where you've been for the last 48 hours. They know absolutely everything, or will know absolutely everything there is to know about you. What you buy, what you do, what you like, what you dislike. That is power.
Because what I heard is that sort of maybe the word I heard was something like the Uberification, that people will know that the way if once they know your habits and your patterns, then like there could be a sliding scale of, oh, you need a plumber, do you? Well, it's Christmas Eve. That's £1,000. You can afford to pay it. That you can have a kind of a flexible capitalism that's responding to the consumer and extracting as much as possible. Yeah. What I suppose is, so one of the things that you seem to suggest early, Jacques, is that without some oppositional force, the limitless growth of corporatism will devour everything, and we're already at the point where it's devouring the planet itself. And like traditionally we would imagine the opposing force to be provided by the state, but the state has now become essentially the administrator for corporatism, so that opposition won't be provided.
I think what you've seen with, and I'm not the first person to say this, but when you see Brexit and Trump, you see in a sort of inarticulated response to the end of the state. You see people wanting to take power back because they can sense an end. But they don't, do you see what I mean? There's a sense in which the state has lost its potency.
Yes, before we can articulate it, we know it. We know, this doesn't work no more.
It's felt, and people understand it. And so, but I think what someone said, one entrepreneur said rather chillingly and brilliantly to me. He said, "What we do is we invent a problem and then provide the solution." And so that's really what a lot of these products are about. When you talk about data and you talk about the plumber and so on, what you really want to do is you want to start giving people options that they never knew they had.
What's an example of that?
For instance, if you watch this series, you're going to like this series. If you like that series, you'll want to go on this holiday. If you want to go on that holiday, you'll like to buy this car. If you want to buy this car, you might like to go dating these 27 different women. There's an endless tree that can be opened up in terms of what your consumer decisions will be off the back of one consumer decision.
And it's like that you're trapped on a plateau of consumerism continually. You don't have another role in your life. Your role is to consume.
Shopping is everything because, when George Bush was asked after 9/11, what could the public do after 9/11, Twin Towers, he said, go shopping. That was his solution.
Yes.
Go shopping wasn't a frivolous thing. Go shopping is actually what Elon Musk's solution is to the automation revolution. He says that essentially the only thing we can do productive to the economy is spend money. Consumerism is what it's all based upon. Debt is absolutely at the heart of it. So the increasing debt that we have goes hand in hand with the need for us to continue buying stuff. And so what you'll come to, Elon Musk has said, we'll all be paid a universal wage for basically going shopping. Once robots do everything, robots will be taxed, we'll get the money, and then we'll go down to Primark. And that is the future for humanity.
That George W. Bush moment, it's curious coming as it did off the back of a seismic event that represented in so many ways, perhaps some unseen, a cultural clash. That his a response to it was go shopping. It is the modern equivalent of saying pray. Go and pray, because that is our ideology. That is when we talk about extremism in the more obvious forms of, sort of religious extremism, we seem unaware that the dominant extremist ideology is one where we are consumers, and like you said, entering potentially into a time where you are nothing but a consumer.
Absolutely, and I think what's interesting is when we move to online shopping, what's that going to do to the cathedrals of consumerism? The shopping centres, these places where we go to worship the god of shopping. Because in a sense, that replacement of God with shopping has been with us for half a century. It's kind of what we know. And shopping is a profound thing. It's not only profound in terms of how the economy operates, it's also profound in terms of what it does neurologically to us. We talk glibly about shopping addiction, retail therapy and so on. But those feelings, that endorphin rush, that release of happiness that has to be replicated, that addiction, and you know about this stuff, that addiction to that feeling has to be replicated faster and faster and more often and more often. The shopping is at the heart of who we are, how we define ourselves in relation to our neighbours and our friends. It's absolutely everything. It's the heart of capitalism.
Yes, it's the way it's the way we see ourselves. If we're not consuming, we're not existing. Now, whilst I see that the economic analysis that you're conducting it seems to me, is the truest way of understanding this problem. It's valid, it's demonstrable, it's scientific. You can go, look, this is where power is. Look at how it's responding. Look at the decisions that are being made. Look at this reality. Look at these deals. That's why you're living in this reality. That's the way of tracing it. In terms of change, it seems it would be very difficult to implement change on an economic level because there isn't, by definition, all of the power is held by people that want to maintain these systems systems.
I think if you understand why they got Earth to the place it's in, which was money, you understand how money is perhaps the only way that will get us out. You know, I spoke to Peter Thiel, who created PayPal. He's a Silicon Valley billionaire. He said the whole problem with the way we framed global warming has been in terms of a moral argument. We've said to the public, this is bad. People don't care. Daniel Kahneman, the behavioral economist, said there's an extraordinary moment. Basically, when a problem is too far away, we don't deal with it. When it's too close, it's too late. He said there's a window of opportunity where something can be done, and that's literally where we are with Earth right now. But you see, to go back to what Peter Thiel was saying, he said if there's money to be made from saving Earth, then believe you me, we'll have clouds with Evian logos on them. We'll have cows with, Monsanto logos on them. You know, if that's what's required to sort the Earth out, is to find a way of making money from the salvation of the Earth, then that's the way forward.
Yes, but there isn't.
A slightly bleak view, but
I mean, another quote that recurs in this program is it's easier to envisage the end of the world than it is to envisage the end of capitalism.
Yeah.
But this economically led,
one will come before the other.
Yeah, seemingly. But I can't see how it can be amended through economic means, unless you sort of, you for a moment there touched on that there are sort of biochemical imperatives to purchase and spending. We're doing it because we get a feeling inside our anatomy within our consciousness. For me, like the opposition can only change if people start looking at reality in a very different way. That's what I think is being suggested. The way that we intuitively are starting to understand that nation state is ending or is already defunct, except for in a superficial way. I think that we also know that huge change is required outside of the systems that we currently live within.
I'm kind of a believer in the economics myself. I tend to think, I interviewed Thomas Piketty, and he's kind of an interesting guy, the French economist, who wrote Capital. And I said to him, this moment, what's to be done? And he said, well, with corporations, we could, we could create a global tax system. We could retool the IMF and turn them into a force with teeth that could deal with corporations. I said that you're basically like asking for Thunderbirds to go in. That's not going to happen. And he said, the other thing is, well, we could have a revolution. And I said, well, in what way are we going to have a revolution? Because the revolutions that you look at, traditionally, you look at the Russian Revolution, you even look at the failed 68 attempt at a revolution. What were they? They were on an economic rise where you had a prosperous middle class that was demanding more. What we have now, and he said, but what you have now is a potentially combustible force of a middle class who are disenfranchised from what they believe they're entitled to from the last 40 years, plus a huge underclass of people who literally cannot exist. And that together is a recipe for revolution. That's what Piketty was saying. And I think, what we do have in history is we have the inevitability of change. That's one thing for sure. So whatever we feel is now the catastrophe of the moment we're in, that is going to change. Which way it's going to go, who knows? But things are becoming more dramatic. The cycles are becoming more dramatic. And as Adam Curtis said in his film Hypernormalization, we've normalized the catastrophe to a point where we accept that as part of the cycle. And so that's an interesting thing.
We'll be talking more about revolution towards the end of our conversation, but to emphasise and highlight now the nature of this catastrophe, can you explain to us what's happening within agriculture that demonstrates the severity of the problem?
Ask me that. I will tell you, it's pretty extraordinary. Because you shouldn't have asked me that, because I just don't want to tell people what's going on.
Why?
No, I'll
it's
tell
so
you.
bad.
No, I'll tell you. I mean, basically, the WHO did a report 2 years ago now that backed up a lot of science that was being done across the globe. They put it in one place, and they basically analysed a lake in the Haute-Savoie region of France, which had been undisturbed for 1,000 years, really. They looked at the sediment in that lake, and it was a kind of really interesting experiment. Bear with me on this. What they found was that the sediment had been pretty much undisturbed up until the Industrial Revolution. Then, obviously, things, it had started to change. The nature of the sediment had changed. What happened in the last 40 years was that basically the nutrients had completely depleted. So as a result of intensive farming, not just to create wheat, but also to create basically animals and dairy for us to eat and consume, we had leached the soil of all its nutrients, resulting in the fact that we have just 60, they estimated 60 harvests left in the planet.
Wow. So that's sort of a food Armageddon is approaching.
Yeah, and it's kind of, and again, you know, when you talk to people in Silicon Valley, they say, you know, we're across this stuff because it's an opportunity. And you say, well, in what way is it an opportunity? Synthetic soil, vertical farming, off-world farming. They're talking about the Martian for real. Could we turn the moon into an agricultural place? Could we move all the heavy industry into space? That's what Jeff Bezos' plan is. You know, this is the stuff that they're dealing with now. You know, 10 years ago, it was all tech. It was all Silicon Valley was all about going into the micro of the micro detail of how a phone works. What can a phone deliver as a computer? Now it's like looking
Super
out to
macro.
space. It's all a super macro. And that's where all the R&D is.
When I think about my own life, it's kind of evident that there is a problem just from the way that I consume. I'm a person that's aware of these kind of arguments, but like when I think of my domestic waste, I think, oh God, that shouldn't be getting thrown away. This doesn't seem right. That there is a detachment, there is a lack of consciousness. And I can see how sort of this is a personal problem on one level, and I think we feel hugely disempowered. You think, oh, I'll put that in the recycling, that'll help, maybe I should do some more composting, but you will, in the face of these forces, it feels irrelevant. The other thing that I'm learning, a massive disjunct in terms of power and what a theme that is between the personal and the power. The other thing I get from what you just said, Jacques, is that when they talk about, you know, oh, we'll just, you know, colonize the moon or whatever it is this week. Yeah. You know, like, it makes me realize how detached the powerful are from the lives of ordinary people. Because you mentioned a moment ago that the combustible revolutionary engine will be a middle class, which is like a lot of people feeling like that the privilege that they're entitled to, the resources and comfort that they're entitled to, is being eroded. And then a giant underclass. Now, that underclass is as long ago been nominated as disposable, whether it was in colonisation, slavery, onwards, perhaps even earlier than that, that there's a huge percentage of the population that we do not care. You are already machines, and when we get better machines to replace you, you know, like if we can find a nice way of framing genocide, that's what's going to happen.
There's a brilliant Paul Mason does a brilliant thing called the car wash paradox, and it's basically what was the car wash? The car wash in the 1950s was this amazing, shiny new piece of technology. Right here, it was going to automate. Fluffy buds would come out and clean your car, and it would all look amazing. What's happened in the last 5 years? The last 10 years, car washes have started closing down. Right. They're in prime locations in the centres of cities, which can then be turned into luxury flats. All these automated machines have disappeared, and what has replaced them? Weird dead spaces on the outskirts of town where you have immigrant labour or cheap labour doing the job that machines were doing. So, you know, one option, you know, the machines have been made redundant by human beings. The difference being that human beings have absolutely no rights. They can be sacked there and then, and the whole thing can be taken down in 24 hours, right? So that is one future that we might have. The machines might not replace everyone. What we might have is this incredible moment. You know, what we see on the news nightly is we say full employment. Employment's never been higher, and yet they say also wages are stagnating. How can these two things correlate at the same time? Well,
because full employment would mean increasing
rise in part-time work, because of gig economy, because people. What you'll have is the people are working for like Deliveroo, Uber. You know, so basically with no right, you know, the very limited rights, such as we decided this week.
It's a reversal of all of the things that were fought for in the last century for unionisation,
full employment, but with no one working for any money. So you know, is that the other future that we might have? These are very radical changes to the structure of society. And, you know, a society that was kind of, you know, maybe what we're doing is going back to, we had a period of stability from 1940 roughly to the end of the 90s. So what we're doing is going back to that previous period, a period of huge human instability. You know, we call that class the precariat. We're all part of the precariat.
Well,
the precariat.
You're in a precarious position.
Yeah, instead of being a proletariat, it's beyond that. It's the ultimate precarious class, the global class.
One of the themes I've noticed over the course of these podcasts is the way that power functions is to, as best as possible, morph to facilitate its ongoing survival. E.g., like once slavery gets banned, it's like, what's the closest we can approximate slavery without using that word? Well, you could pay people next to nothing. Yeah. And when you give that car wash example, it's like that. And what concerns me when you use the Silicon Valley tech entrepreneur new sovereignty of these great powerful corporations that now dominate the globe is that in their utopia, the problems of ordinary people are irrelevant. It doesn't matter that there is this grey, amorphous underclass, almost not matter anymore, now almost a mist that are just holding up reality.
Yeah, you have a kind of soma state of bliss, which is kind of created by, a mixture of, pharmaceutical, what you have is you have a mental health crisis in Britain. You have an unprecedented level of prescription drugs. I interviewed a GP in Blackpool, which is the depression capital of Britain, and I sort of said, what do pharmaceutical drugs do here? What do antidepressants do? And she said, well, you could argue that they enable poverty. What do they do? What do they do? I said, do they enable poverty? And she said, that's such a complex question, but at heart, it could be the case that, essentially, what are we doing? Are we medicating people where they can endure otherwise unbearable conditions? And what is the consequence? What are the social and economic consequences of that? What are the consequences of obesity, which is its correlation with socioeconomic background? What is the correlation with the creation of cheap, what we call disparagingly cheap white goods, the crash in the price of technology, so that people are absolutely addicted, stuck to technology, when essentially, 25 years ago, that technology was even beyond their economic bracket. They weren't able to afford that stuff. Now, these are big questions that I'm not saying I have the answers to, but these are the kind of macro issues that we should be tackling, and not kind of separating off, fat's over here and it's unconnected to poverty. Technology is unconnected to aspiration. Everything is connected, and you have to understand that.
Everything is connected. There's a mental health crisis, but the mental health crisis is itself a result of this economic paradigm.
Of course.
That's incredible. So it's in creating people for whom life is unbearable. And instead of going, should we look at this economic model? Oh, no. Simply drug the people that are the offcuts of this problem.
There's a direct correlation between mental health and your income. I mean, Blackpool is one of the most depressed cities in Britain. It also has there's a direct correlation between obesity and Britain being the most overworked, underpaid country. I mean, those two things are not an accident.
But even beyond the income, Jack, is the quality of life that people are living. Is if you are meaningless and your life is meaningless and you have no value and you have no purpose and your role in society is simply to consume, knowing that you are what you eat, and what you eat are disposable products, and you are a disposable product, that's going to induce a huge existential crisis. I have the image of, like, when you're dealing with a liar and, like, all the evidence points to, hold on a minute, it's causing a mental health crisis. Don't worry, just drug them. It's causing an ecological crisis. Don't worry, we'll go to the moon. Yeah. It's like, well, why don't you deal with the actual thing of, like, you can't run life as a profit-making machine anymore?
Because there's a struggle. I think that's dead right. And I think there's I think the struggle that people don't realise, they see capitalism as this monolithic evil. They think, there's these companies that are trying to screw everyone over. Actually, the reality is the real struggle now is not between workers and bosses. It's between CEOs of companies who genuinely want to bring about change. There's a guy who runs Unilever, and he said, I said, what's your greatest achievement? He said, it was to get rid of the hedge fund managers, to get rid of short money, short-term profit motive within this company. We have to do something about global warming. When you speak to them, they talk like they're at Occupy or something. They don't talk like they're the CEO of a global corporation. And the reason why is because they know that government can't do it. Paris climate change is a failure. Government can't do this stuff. It's almost like they think no one else can do it. We've got the power. We have to do it. So the struggle of the future will be business versus business. It'll be the business visions of people like Mark Zuckerberg, who basically said, essentially in that Facebook thing that he put up, I am going to stand for president, because now he's seen that Trump can do it, his version versus Trump's version. That's what you'll have. You'll have competing business visions of what the future should be.
Except all of these people, without human beings, are nothing. The resource is ordinary people. Unless someone can bypass that, unless people say that the reason that you're engaged in this economic game is so that other people can benefit and facilitate, and the only way to change it is to disengage from the economic gain, and the only way you're going to be able to do that is by finding an alternative to making yourself feel better. You know, unless and like for me, this is where religion becomes interesting. It's because it's a model that exists outside economics, although it was co-opted by economics early in its life.
Is it a surprise that religion is fighting back? When we look at religion in various forms as being the last, basically, there's no result. There's no accident that jihadism stands as a kind of almost as a sort of caliphate black flag alternative. That doesn't have to be the only alternative. But again, rather like Trump, it's an inarticulated, slightly incohesive, difficult to comprehend version of an alternative.
Because fear, like on an emotional level, fear and desire of that, they are irrational. People are being kept in an irrational state to perpetuate consuming, so that fear and desire is basically what you're continually feeling. These are irrational states. So irrational alternatives seem attractive. I think that Trump was just desserts. If you feed people that information continually, jingoism, tell people that nothing has any meaning, eventually you will get this. And Brexit, the same thing. I feel that the conditions were created for it. Now there are alternate narratives even within this global context. I'm very interested in the example of China because they exist outside of our story. So can you tell us what the significance of China is?
China, you have the kind of, when I talked about the different corporations, and you have Putin running China, Russia PLC. You've got, Trump like kind of failing Chrysler of the United States, like some mid-70s corporation. Then if you look at China, China's quietly getting on with it. And the interesting thing is they've squared the circle of democracy and, growth. When you go to Davos, what you hear, which is the meeting of the heads of government every year, the annual meeting in Switzerland, the endless debate is, how does democracy get in the way? Is democracy compatible with the future? As though democracy is in crisis. There's endless discussion about democracy being in crisis. In China, what happened? In China, they basically, Tiananmen Square was a watershed, because at that moment it appeared as if democracy was going to have to be the thing that the ruling party gave away to the middle class. No. You don't need to do that. What you need to do is you need to sell them consumer goods. You need to move them into being an aspirant middle class, like a Western middle class. You can buy off any demands for democracy. And so China squared that circle.
How did it do it? So it made consumer goods available
without... Essentially turned, China used to be the workshop of the West. So, you'd always have like when I was a kid, I had my...
made in China.
Made in China on the thing. No longer. Now it's China's turn to be like the West was and to become this, the largest market in the world. And essentially we produce, or Africa or whoever, India, whoever decides to become the workshop for China, produces cheap goods for China. China is the country that the planet now pivots on. China basically bailed out the United States after the subprime crash. So, it's basically like a giant HSBC loan. China is the bank, and that's
really
the world. Yeah.
After that crash, China facilitated
twice
it.
China has bailed out the US.
So that means America is in debt to China.
Yeah,
when you're talking about these secret deals that govern the world, so that is happening that is happening at the level of sovereign or at least national states, right? That's not, or is it?
Well, because what you've got China operating like a corporation, so it's like
but more
it's a corporation with a board, like a highly successful corporation. But what's interesting is the Chinese, they have this. This year, they launched OBOR, which is their grand plan for the future of the planet.
Sounds bloody terrifying.
OBOR, one belt, one road. It's the recreation of the Silk Road, which was basically the trade route to the West, the trade route that connects the planet, globalized the planet. What they see is China creating a new Silk Road, but they're in charge. They also see the unprecedented need for power in terms of, the pollutant aspect of what's going to happen with growth. They see that being dealt with by an unprecedented rise in investment in global in solar and wind power. And so there's sort of a weird combination of ultra frightening and ultra optimistic. It's like you don't know which way they're going to go, and you don't quite know how to read it. It's a kind of combo of the two.
I have two questions I hope you can answer. One is, how did they avoid democracy just through consumerism? What did they do? Just goes, don't worry, we can have these products now.
Tiananmen Square was basically the end. Tiananmen Square was a catalyst in terms of,
I remember
it was
that.
a major,
it was like
major
people came out on the street, the man with the shopping bags in front of a tank. We'll never forget that guy. But how did that? So that people were demanding, we want to be engaged in power, but instead it was like, no, you can have these things. But how do you actually? What does that actually mean?
Well, I think because what you do is you create. I mean, in a way, China has a very deep-rooted belief in the state, in loyalty to the state, the individual and the state being as one. They come from this idea, the doctrine of the mean, which is an Asian principle that, essentially any kind of dispute, a dispute between you and I, you're not right, I'm not right, but the solution lies in the middle, in a place that neither you nor I have thought of. So it's the doctrine of the mean is a philosophy of how you deal with problems, how you deal with solutions. We come from a kind of completely different, we come from the Enlightenment, from the idea of a discourse, me putting my argument, you putting your argument, either you're right or I'm right.
So it's combative.
So it's combative, which was the dialectic, So we come from a completely different place.
So there's a sort of a spiritual...
It's a fundamental thing. It's a fundamentally part of what it is to be Chinese, is this notion.
Yes, and that would not have been wouldn't have been underwritten by ideas of statehood initially. That would have been sort of self and otherness, wouldn't it? That, that in original Confucian terms.
The rice field being this really important thing. The rice field being a sort of symbol of the state, so that the grains of rice are like the citizens. They're all part of the greater good of the state, and that you understand that your place is as part of the state, whereas we don't have that notion at all. We have the notion of the hunter-gatherer, or we have
more
a very
individualistic,
an individualistic sense,
So China has sort of philosophical roots that are gonna help them prevail, because because of our identity myths have got individualism stitched into them. So but how is how is but it's still presumably it's a stratified society, China. So they've sort of diverted from any idea of sort of equality.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because you still have demands for rights, you still have a middle class, human beings will always demand what human beings demand. And so I think the situation for China, and I'm not an expert on China, but, if you get one in, it'll be very interesting to hear what they have to say about this. But it seems to me that the future for China lies in they're very cleverly avoiding the Western route. They don't want to take the route that the United States took. They don't want to be the country that became a superpower and then went into decline.
Yes.
And so, and I think part of that, key to that, is staying true to the philosophy. And just this year, Jinping has basically become the ultimate. He's given himself the highest accolade. He's the new Mao. So he's absolutely total. He has total power over the state. He is the state.
What is China's relationship with corporations then? They have avoided some of the dilemmas that we have.
It's fascinating. It's really interesting, because if you look at how Western corporations bend themselves towards the Chinese market, because what they see is the biggest market in the world. And so how do we go into that market? Apple, Google, you see that they have their own versions of all the tech brands that we already have. So to some degree, do they need to even have our tech brands? They don't need to ape us anymore. Chinese have no sense of needing to ape the West anymore. They're doing their own thing all the gene editing that they're doing now, the CRISPR-9 stuff. I don't know if you know about all that, but it's basically, they're absolutely leading the world, So it's there's no sense in which I think we patronizingly looked at China always as how is it going to develop? How is it going to leapfrog us? Well, they just think about the world in a different way from us.
I see. It's not a narrative that exists as a comparative, except from our perspective. They have their own original ideology that is distinct and separate, and no longer needs to see itself in dialectic or discourse with our Western narrative. And in fact, according to their own natures and your motif, they have a self-contained ideology where the individual and the state can have a harmonious relationship, and this is going to be hugely beneficial for them going forward. And the thing that you said a moment ago, Jacques, about the combustible force of a growing underclass and a dissatisfied middle class, I'm very interested in engaging and understanding these forces. One thing that is interesting to me is with this sort of recent attempt to re-engage national identity, like the examples we've mentioned, Trump, Brexit, stuff that's happening throughout Europe, and it's destined to fail, these ideas. People marching in Charlottesville aren't going to get what they want. People that want to reimpose a national identity, they're not going to get what they want. The sort of source satisfaction and pain will continue. And many of the examples that you've given across this show of health crisis, agricultural crisis, they all point to the power of these transnational corporations. Now, when people are saying what we want is to, condemn migrants, they are simply another symptom of the problem that you have diagnosed. How do you think we can engage the energy of these basically everybody in the world? How do you direct that? How do you tell this story? What have you learned about?
It's all. I make these series and I try to analyse in as objective a way as possible how things work. How the world works. And what people say to me every single time is, what are the solutions? What's your solution to this? What do we do? And in a way, that is enough that people ask that question, because we're at a moment where we can't talk about revolution in a 20th century way. We can't talk about people going to the barricades and deciding that they're going to take over the post office or something. That isn't going to happen.
Got the post office.
Yeah, we got the post office.
Everyone's been shot.
We're going to a space where it's that thing that you mentioned earlier about the super micro and the super macro. It's kind of, we laugh when we put stuff in our recycling bin. But, I went to Detroit and went to Camden, New Jersey, which is the most poverty-stricken city, it's the most crime-ridden city in America. But people are moving there because it's super cheap. It's like basically you've got people starting up businesses and you just think, there's kind of something. They're growing vegetables in their front lawn. There's something kind of laughable and laudable and brilliant at the same time about people just doing stuff for themselves. It's almost a kind of millennial, generational sort of reaction to this idea that you've got to be on Twitter and Facebook and whatever it is endlessly. It's a kind of almost like progressive Ludditism or something. Do you see what I mean? The kind of techno prairie. Someone said, "Oh yeah, we're on the techno prairie. We're all got Wi-Fi, but I'm growing carrots." It's kind of like I think there's going to be 50 different strains of rebellion against the system, whatever the hell the system is. And I think it'll take the form of those guys who've just bought 1 inch of the Trump wall. Today they've decided to buy a metre of the ground where Trump plans to build the wall across Mexico, and they've said we're going to make it legally impossible for him to do so. That is a clever lateral way of rebelling, and I think that that's what human beings are doing all the time. I try to buy south in a kind of prosaic way. I try to basically the auction, the franchise was up for South Eastern Railways. It was the most failing British railway, and the commuters have a miserable time. I said to the BBC and to the commuters, why don't we try and run the railway ourselves? Why don't we bid for the franchise? We put together a bid just from all the people who were on the train. You had expertise on the train of you had nurses, care workers, accountants, every conceivable hedge fund managers, every conceivable person brought together for the purposes of a common good. And the Department of Transport turned it down. just simply because they said we hadn't gone through the right hoops, but essentially we'd put together a credible plan, which was then taken on board by them. And you think that's kind of the future, thinking laterally, thinking differently, connecting with people in unexpected ways. And who the hell knows what will happen?
Revolution, I suppose, is taking your power back. It's saying, I'm going to have my power. I'm not going to defer it. I'm not going to subscribe to other people's ideas and systems. And whether it is, growing vegetables on a techno prairie or refusing to participate economically, it's this sense that you have authority and authorship of your own life. Something you said earlier about the CEOs themselves sort of wanting to resolve these problems, I find quite inspiring, because all of these systems and ideas are built upon people and are resourced by people and require people in order to perpetuate themselves. And what that makes me think, Jacques, is that if you can buy what people are trying to do, like at the arse end of this, necking antidepressants in Blackpool and eating bad, salty, sugary food and buying crap disposable goods, they're trying to feel good. They're trying to feel happy.
Totally.
And the system that they are trying to process these feelings through can no longer provide for them. So I feel that what you said, like whether there'll be 50 different ways, that the how is not important. The thing that's important is that you just start to reclaim your power.
It's a very middle class. I hate people in a way who are engaged in politics, because to me it's quite a bourgeois kind of. It's quite an interesting thing that we even think we have the luxury of sitting here like we are discussing these things. Most people are just trying to survive. And you buy a bag of chips after having done a 16-hour shift. You don't give a toss about global economics or corporations and so on. But one thing you want is what you said, is you want your life to be better. And it's sort of, that's why, changing your life and doing it at the micro level is kind of revolutionary, because that's what matters to people. Yes, that's actually what matters.
It seems abstract because, like, in some senses, we live in infinite space, but we also live in Camden, New Jersey. The idea of infinite space or the globe ought be abstract. It's nice that we know it, but the fact is we live in ourselves, we live in our community, and we need to have different relationships at that level.
Well, that's really community, you see. When I was in New Jersey, and the reason I had this sort of, slightly, without sounding too weird, I had a kind of epiphany moment where I was sort of in the street and you've got like drug dealers cavorting around on like children's bikes and things. It's just sofas in the middle of the road. It's just like it's like a joke. It's like The Wire, but for real. And you're sort of there, and there was this guy, and he was busking, and he was like on a street corner, and he had a lollipop. He had a broken up guitar which he'd put tape on, and he was using the lollipop as a plectrum. And I thought, no one's going to give, you're like an entrepreneur. No one's going to give you money. You're in like the most depressed place in the world. He was giving it a go. Do you know what I mean? He was like giving it a go. And I thought, my God, it's like you walk down a street, any street in Britain or anywhere in the world, and you see 50 businesses, some of which will fail, some of which, and it's like all of them, somebody's had some crazy idea to start a business and they've had a go. And you think there's something sort of inspiring, I think, about the idea of people then utilizing that spirit, that human spirit, to survive, but then doing something together. Everyone who was in Camden in New Jersey said to me, the reason we moved here is because of community. They said, we feel connected to the other businesses. We are all together trying to make the community work. We're employing local people. I spoke to a guy who worked in the print works, and he said, I would 100% be dead. He was a drug dealer. He'd been a drug dealer for 20 years. He ended up getting a job for the first time in this place. He said, I would 100% be dead if these two 19-year-olds hadn't come here and started this print works. And you think, and they were only hiring people from that. So maybe rebuilding community. What do we have in Britain? We have isolated, atomized people who don't know their neighbours, don't know anyone old, people who live in solitary lives and are unconnected to anyone. Building community is really at the heart of what could happen.
We unthinkingly submit our ingenuity to a pre-existing system that has at its heart, not as you said earlier, as a Machiavellian intent, but just as its unthinking MO, our subjugation. So immediately you say our business is going to make money in order to. And the other problem built in is that we still try to use sort of state solutions. Well, the state will prevent transnational corporations. Well, we now know that can't happen except in China, but that has an entirely different anthropological origin. Yeah. So it seems to me that because this is the bloody thing that sort of that prevents me from being simply a narcissist, is that I deeply, deeply care that people are suffering in this way. It's something about it makes me very unhappy and furiously angry. And I kind of believe it's possible for it to change that. Yeah, you must do, because otherwise you wouldn't have asked around making all these documentaries, would you, and putting yourself through all that bloody grief when you could be out shopping with your missus and your mother-in-law.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's
that's right.
But this
we all are. We all care, but it's just that everyone cares because we're human beings, aren't we?
Yes.
The woman who ran Coca-Cola said to me, "Look, she said to me, I am, I accused her and their company of creating obesity and so on, the high fructose corn syrup and all the rest of it. And she turned to me and she said, yes, we did all that. We didn't know what we were going to do. We didn't know that was going to be the end result. And then she turned to me and she said, I am a mother. And I thought that was an interesting thing to say, because she was sort of saying, I am a human being.
Yes.
Please be reminded, I am human. I understand the consequences of these decisions. And that is, you kind of have to hope that's
fantastic.
Interesting.
That's beautiful.
Interesting.
It's like, remind yourself this, because a minute ago, mate, you said that thing about if you've done a 16-hour shift scaffolding or whatever, you probably are going to just have some chips and not think I better listen to the Russell Brand podcast. Although it is what you should be doing. So I'm actually making it for you. If you're a scaffolder, please write in. That you don't feel connected to sort of abstract ideological ideas. But the reality is, your primary identity, whether you're a CEO of Coke or a scaffolder, is that I'm a father, I'm a brother, I'm a mother, I'm a sister, a daughter. So, I don't, it's weird because we do these things where sometimes we're talking about Brexit or whatever, and I think Brexit don't impact my life as much as some shit my daughter might have said this morning, or my dog. We're humans. We're living human lives. These are ideological things. As long as they're not impeding on our lives, they should be kept in the abstract. Exactly. So, and I think the only way to do that is to, this may seem somewhat bloody reductive given who I'm talking to, but it's to somehow replicate the communal units that we would tend to, if unimpeded by post-agricultural ideological forms that benefit elites and inhibit and subjugate ordinary individuals.
I think that's really spot on, in the sense I often think, and it's kind of really weird, but I often think about the kind of Freudian emotional underpinning of capitalism, how everything is really emotion. They really, even like we're all sitting here, Gareth's not saying a word, you're sitting over, but there's a kind of it's a sort of dance. Everything is a kind of really nuanced psychological dance. I'm talking to you, you're talking to me, we're kind of getting on, but it could have gone badly. And it could have rested on one thing you said or something I did. It's absolutely tiny, tiny decisions that can have massive implications. You think if you applied that to economics, you applied that to the decisions that corporations make, whereby you appeal to the humanity of people, you deal with people on an emotional level. And I've seen this actually does have an effect. We kind of overplay the hard money side, and we underplay the weird emotional, psychological side.
Because both of those things are resourced by the primal. The desire to gain resources has a primal engine. So it's almost like I feel that philosophically, psychologically, it's like, that you want to navigate people to their cradle and their deathbed continually. Like, you were born once and you are going to die. Now let's accept that basis and make decisions from there, not continually in there. Well, I'm the CEO. I've got to do this by Wednesday. We've got a pie chart or whatever it is they have now. So, take these people that come up with these ludicrous maxims and ideas, and it's an opportunity that the Earth's only got 60 harvests in it. I go, no, you're going to die. You can't, and that's why the reason that I sort of am interested in religion is not because of the sort of the bizarre cultural artifacts that accrues as a result of its time of origin or the ludicrous prejudice that one finds. No, but because it's dealing with the fundamental: you were born, you're going to die, you experience things that seem to be very similar from what other people are experiencing. Can we build systems on that basis? And because I suppose there are sort of differences between us, it seems that what we require are communities that are of a certain size, where the individual members of that community have power within that community, that other communities are allowed to be run according to their own values, and that the idea of that being on a national level these days is finished because it's too many people to do it to, and the state no longer has the legitimacy of being the thing that defends us from, I don't know, the barbarian barbarians, whether those are corporate barbarians or barbarians that are outside of our sovereignty.
100%. It's like Aristotelian, isn't it? You're basically saying you're making an argument for the Greek polis, for the city-state, a state that Aristotle said had to have a defined boundary in terms of its size, number of inhabitants for it to work. Economically, it could only work at this scale. Any bigger, it becomes corrupted, it becomes destroyed. You know, it's kind of interesting, isn't it? How far have we come?
That is the argument I'm making. It might be a bit even smaller than the city because of chimps can only handle 75 people. So it's like an Aristotle city.
I'm up for the chimp city.
The chimp city. Well, Under the Skin has finally reached the conclusion it's a city full of chimps scratching themselves, picking stuff out of each other's hair and doing things that chimps do. So your book, Done, The Secret Deals That Are Changing the World, it is out now.
Yeah, it is now, apparently. Yeah, and the paperback's out in February, but it's out now, yeah.
Get this book. I'll be getting it and reading it. Don't feel mad and weird and conflicted that you're probably buying it from Amazon. Simply accept that this is the way the world is now.
I say thank God for capitalism, Russell, because what would we be doing?
This is like you'll be listening to this on your iPhone. You'll be buying my book and Jack's book from Amazon, and hopefully they think just going listlessly planting a carrot in your front garden. I'm taking my power back. Have that, Monsanto. Actually, the seed was made by Monsanto and it's copyrighted. You can't plant it there. Oh, damn you. Damn you, God. Right, now you're talking. You've started the right conversation finally. Cheers, Jack. That was an amazing chat.
That was brilliant. Thanks you so much. That was really good.
This show was sponsored, of course, by my new book, Recovery, which is available now. You can order it on Amazon. Also, come check me on my Rebirth tour. Birmingham, 5th of December. Leicester, 6th of December. Brixton, 19th of December. And if you like this show, subscribe to it and give it 5 stars on whatever platform you're downloading it from. Thank you very much. That was Under the Skin with Russell Brand.